Hey Mustangs, in these notes we're going to take a look at the process of speciation, and the key word here being species. So before we actually get into speciation itself, we're going to step back, take a look, refresh our memory about what a species is. Okay, so a species is a group of organisms so similar that they can mate and produce fertile offspring. So we learned this way back, all the way in I don't know, September maybe. So when you have a species, they look similar internally, externally, and they can get together, mate, and produce babies. And their babies can also get together with others of the same species and produce babies. So the key here is being able to mate and produce offspring that can have babies as well. Okay? Now, along the lines of evolution, along the lines of change, when we look at all the species that exist today, they are basically changed versions of older species. So let's take a look. So here, each of these pictures represents a different species. When you look at them, they're organisms that are similar internally and externally, and they can mate with each other. Now, across species, they can't mate. So, for example, a hammerhead shark here and a tuna can't get together, mate, and produce fertile offspring. Same thing here, an elephant can't get with a grasshopper and produce fertile offspring. But elephants can get with other elephants and produce babies, and their babies can have babies. Okay, so each one of these species, they can mate within their own species and produce fertile offspring. All right, so how do you get species to give rise to other species? Well, the process of forming a new species is called speciation. Okay, so speciation means that an organism, a species, is going to change over time to become a new species. Now, one species branches into two closely related species. That's the best way of thinking about it. So you can have a starting species and it's going to branch into two different species. When the branching occurs, they can remain either very similar to each other, or there can be major changes that add up over time. So this is basically our natural selection flowchart. So if you remember our flowchart, there's two outcomes when the environment changes for natural selection: either extinction or change. And on the change side, we said that there can be very few changes and they remain like their ancestor species, or it could be major changes occur and they actually branch to form a new species. So that's what we're talking about here with speciation, the branching process. One species branches into two closely related species. Okay, so here is an example. So here we have the starting species, and it's going to branch. It's going to separate into two different species that change over time to become two different species. Another way that speciation can occur, it's still branching. So one species branches into several different species. Here in this case, though, what you notice that's different from here, you still have the species, the original species, and it just branched. So some individuals became a different species, and this led to a different species over here. Same thing here, it's the exact same example, but in this case with birds, you start with an original species and it branches and it changes into two different species over time. Over here, branching again, but here you still have the ancestral species, the original species, and it just branched, forked off into two different species. So now we have three species in this case. Okay, this isn't something that happens like that. This is something that happens over time, changes that add up over hundreds of thousands, or millions of years. Okay, so here taking an organism that we've already talked about, the crocodile. So the crocodile actually branched into different species. Okay, so here we have, in modern day times, going from the original crocodile ancestors, we have the saltwater croc. Here are alligators. Here are caimans, and here are gavials. Okay, and these definitely look weird compared to the other ones. They have these really long, skinny snouts. But the ancestral crocodile species branched to form these different species that we see today. Okay, so the big thing is, what causes branching to occur then? Why do species branch off and form different species? Okay, well, first is isolation. So isolation must occur in order for a new species to form. So when we're talking about isolation, when you have a population of the same species, okay, remember population, same species living in the same place, if they become isolated somehow, that can cause them to branch into two different species. Okay? Now there's two different types of isolation we'll be looking at. The first is geographic isolation. In geographic isolation, there's a physical barrier that separates a population. So you had one population and it became isolated. There's something in between, a physical barrier that keeps them apart. The second type we'll look at is reproductive isolation. And a lot of times in reproductive isolation, they can actually still live in the same place, but they become reproductively isolated within that place. Okay? So first thing, in order for speciation to occur, there has to be some sort of isolation. Second, there needs to be the big three. Okay? So once isolation has occurred, so isolation has to occur first. Once isolation has occurred, then the big three come into play. Natural selection. We know natural selection causes change. If the environment changes, once they become isolated, in both places, once they're isolated, they will change based on their environment. So as the environment changes over here, they'll change on this side. As the environments change over here, they'll change on this side. So natural selection causes change. Genetic drift, so random events. If a fire happens over here and changes the population, but nothing happens over here, well, now you can have a big change on this side, but nothing happening over here. So genetic drift. And the big thing with genetic drift you have to remember is it's especially important in small populations. Genetic drift can cause major changes in small populations. Finally, the last of the big three that will cause change after isolation is mutations. So again, it was one population, it separates into two, they become isolated, natural selection, genetic drift happening here and there, also mutations. If a mutation happens over here, doesn't mean a mutation is going to happen over here. And same vice versa. If a mutation happens over here, doesn't mean it's going to happen over here. So that can lead to change over time as well, and basically the formation of a new species. So let's take a closer look. So first we have geographic isolation. With geographic isolation, you started with the original population, it became separated, became isolated, but in this case there's a physical barrier. So it could be oceans, canyons, lakes, deserts, something that the organisms can't cross. Okay? Now, once you have become geographically isolated and there's this huge barrier in between, natural selection, genetic drift, mutation, natural selection, genetic drift, mutation, they're happening differently in both of the populations, and these guys change over here, these guys change differently over here, and you have the start of speciation. Alright, so here in this example, we're looking at some fish. Okay, so these fish live in the same lake, but now they're going to become geographically isolated. So the lake starts to dry up, and now you have two smaller lakes instead. Over here, the environment changes, and as a result of that, natural selection will take place, and the fish with the right traits will survive, and you'll start to see a change in the species over time. Okay, so over here, natural selection, mutations, genetic drift are happening on this side once the population has become isolated. Over here, same thing. Natural selection, genetic drift, mutations are also happening over here on this side. Okay. Now, the previous example you just saw is actually what happened to the pupfish in Death Valley. Now, Death Valley is this huge, huge desert here in California, but what a lot of people don't know is that Death Valley, at the end of the last ice age, actually had a huge, huge lake in the middle of it. And as the climate has gotten warmer, as the environment has changed, the huge lake has dried up, and now you have several smaller lakes left. And the pupfish, they were all one species that used to live in this big, giant lake, and as they became isolated, they have changed based on the lakes that they have wound up in. So again, we have natural selection, mutations, genetic drift happening in one lake, natural selection, genetic drift, mutations happening in another. So this one's changing over here, this one's changing over here. They're changing differently over time to form a new species. Okay. Here's an example, kind of a simplified example of this. So you had a population, they became geographically isolated. Over here, in this case, we're looking at mutations. So there's a mutation. It was a favorable mutation that helped them survive in their environment that they're living in over here. On the other side, they had a different mutation that occurred, and it was favorable. So you start to see more and more until the species has changed over time. So they now look different from each other or behave differently from each other. So if they were to get back together, they either could not breed or they would not want to breed with each other, and speciation would have occurred. Okay, so on this side, natural selection, mutations, genetic drifts happening on this side. natural selection, mutation, genetic drift happening on this side, leading to a new species. Okay. One more example here before we get into one of the most famous examples of geographic isolation. So here we have a population of beetles. They become geographically isolated. This could be a mountain, river, lake, ocean, something, a physical barrier that prevents them from getting to each other. These guys change over here based on natural selection, mutations, genetic drift. These guys change on this side based on natural selection, mutations, genetic drift. The changes add up on this side, changes add up on that side, and now they have become two different species. They have changed so much that if they did get back together, they either could not or would not breed with each other. Okay? So here's one of the most famous examples of geographic isolation, and these are the Grand Canyon squirrels. So basically, here's the story of these Grand Canyon squirrels. We know that natural selection, mutation, genetic drift are going to play a part. So here you had a population of squirrels, and they were living in this area. Grand Canyon starts to form. So the Colorado River starts coming through, it starts eating away at the land, causing the environment to change, and now they're separated by this canyon. Some squirrels wind up on the south rim, whilst other squirrels wind up on the north rim. Now the environments are very different between the north and south rim. On the north rim, you have green forest. On the south rim, you have desert. Okay? So when they wound up on these different sides here, they wound up in different environments. So over time, natural selection, genetic drift, mutations are happening over here. Any favorable mutations are going to be helpful in natural selection. So over time, this species changes, and individuals with the right traits are more likely to survive on this side. While on the south side, same thing's happening. Genetic drift, mutations, natural selection are happening over here. So any individuals with the right traits for living in the desert environment on this side, they're more likely to survive and pass on their traits. So you start seeing change happen over time. And all those changes add up until the original species you started with, they've changed so different. They become so different over time that if they got back together, they could not or would not mate with each other. All right. So pause the video real quick, and in the box there on your paper, go ahead, draw and explain geographic isolation.